get off my plane. Right now, we don't tolerate thugs in first class." The words landed like a fist in the middle of a quiet Tuesday morning, and for one long, terrible second, nobody in the first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown, Flight 902, made a single sound. Not the businessman in 2A, who had been reading the same page of his novel for the last 10 minutes. Not the retired couple across the aisle, who had been holding hands since before the door closed. Not the junior flight attendant in the back galley, who had been dreading this moment for longer than anyone knew. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The soft jazz that had been piped through the cabin speakers somehow made it worse, all that cheerful, oblivious music floating over something that felt like a crime. Dr. Elijah Bowen did not move. He sat in seat 1A, with his hands resting flat on his thighs. His eyes level, his expression giving away nothing except the very specific kind of stillness that belongs to men who have spent their entire lives learning exactly when to be still and when to act, and who understand that this moment required the former. Beside him, his wife Diana's hand tightened on the armrest, just her hand, just enough that Elijah felt it without looking. Captain Howard Crane stood in the aisle, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, filling the space, the way men who have never once doubted themselves tend to fill a space. And behind him, Patricia Voss, the lead flight attendant with her platinum blonde hair, pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, wearing a small, satisfied smile that she hadn't quite managed to hide in time. Two black people, a full cabin of watching faces, eyes that were either staring or very deliberately not staring, which amounted to the same thing. The crew believed they had all the power in the world. They had no idea what they had just started. 14 hours earlier, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the house on Keswick Road in Baltimore was completely quiet, except for the soft blue glow coming from Elijah's home office at the end of the hall. Diana found him there, the way she often found him, before a big surgery, not pacing, not anxious in any visible way, but sitting very still in front of 3 monitors, studying MRI scans the way a watchmaker studies the inside of something irreplaceable. He had a cup of coffee beside him that had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't noticed. "Elijah," she said from the doorway. "I see it," he said, not looking up. "Right there at the bifurcation. The neck is narrow, but it's workable. I just need to visualize the angle before I'm in the room." She looked at the screen, at the ghostly gray image of a child's brain, at the small, terrible bubble nestled in its deepest part, and she felt the familiar mix of awe and weight that came from being married to a man who could look at something like that and say, workable. Elijah Bowen had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in West Baltimore, the son of a man who cleaned office buildings at night, and a woman who bathed other people's elderly parents for a living. His parents had never owned a car. They had never taken a vacation. What they had done every single day for 18 years was tell their son that the size of his mind was not determined by the size of his circumstances, and that the world would either confirm that or deny it, and that his job was to keep going until it confirmed it. He got a scholarship to Johns Hopkins at 17. He paid for medical school by working nights in a hospital laundry. He spent the first decade of his career being mistaken for an orderly, a parking attendant, a cafeteria worker, every profession, except the one he was actually practicing, and he had responded to every single one of those misreadings by going back into the operating room and doing something that nobody else on earth could do. His hands were insured for $40 million. Not because he had asked for that, but because the hospital's liability attorneys had looked at his surgical record and decided they had no choice. The child on the screen was named Lily Caldwell. She was 10 years old, she liked horses, and had been learning to play the violin, and she had a brain aneurysm in a location so deep and so delicate that every other neurosurgeon her grandfather had consulted had declined to operate. Not from lack of skill, they had all been careful to explain just from an honest assessment of the odds. Elijah had looked at the same scans and said yes. The phone on his desk buzzed just after 4:30, and when he picked it up, the voice on the other end was gravelly and tired, in the way that powerful men sound when they have spent a week being terrified and don't know what to do with that feeling. Richard Caldwell, 71 years old, CEO and majority shareholder of Atlantic Crown Airways, was not a man who frightened easily. But he was frightened now. "Tell me you're packed," Caldwell said. "We leave in 2 hours," Elijah said. "She'll be fine, Richard." There was a long pause. "You don't know that yet." "No," Elijah agreed. "But I will be." He closed the laptop gently, the way you close something you intend to open again under better circumstances, and went upstairs to pack. His surgical loupes the precision magnifying glasses that were as specific to him as a fingerprint. He wrapped carefully in a square of soft cloth and placed them at the top of his leather carry-on. Diana had already packed her own bag. On top of her clothes out of habit, she hadn't bothered to examine. She had placed a fresh legal pad and 3 pens. "I just need to sleep on the plane," he told her in the kitchen, while she poured 2 coffees they wouldn't finish. 6 hours, and I'll be ready." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "You'll be ready in 4, she said. "You always are." The terminal at Miami International was already buzzing at 6 in the morning, with the particular energy of people performing their importance at one another, hard-sided luggage rolling across polished floors, business suits that had been chosen for being seen in voices pitched slightly louder than necessary for phone calls that could have waited. Elijah and Diana moved through it all the way they always traveled quietly, efficiently, without performance. He wore a dark hoodie under a well-made linen blazer, comfortable clothes for a long overnight flight, and dark jeans. She wore a sleek travel set in charcoal gray. No jewelry, no display of anything. They looked like 2 people who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. At gate D9, Patricia Voss stood at the boarding door with the specific smile she had spent 20 years perfecting warm for the passengers she had already decided deserved warmth, managed and watchful for everyone else. When the older white couple in front of Elijah and Diana approached, her whole face opened up. She greeted them by name. She touched the woman's arm. She told them their champagne was already poured. When she turned to Elijah and Diana, the smile didn't disappear entirely. It just changed into something else, something practiced and assessing the kind of look that doesn't come from a person's face, but from somewhere deeper and older and harder to name. She held their boarding passes for longer than she needed, to her eyes moving between the documents and Elijah's face, as if she were trying to reconcile 2 things that didn't fit together in her mind. "I'll need to see your IDs as well," she said. Diana's response was immediate even, and came from 20 years of courtroom instinct. "You didn't ask the couple ahead of us for ID. TSA handles that. You handle boarding passes. It's standard procedure when we need to verify identity," Patricia said, her tone cooling by several degrees. "There have been issues with seat swapping." Elijah put a hand on Diana's arm just briefly, just enough. He pulled out his passport, handed it over without a word. Diana did the same. Patricia opened Elijah's passport and looked at it the way people look at things they are hoping will give them a reason. It didn't. She handed them back, not placed. Handed the way you return something to someone you've decided isn't worth the courtesy of a full gesture, and told them their seats were 1A and 1B, and reminded them about overhead bin space for passengers on upgrade tickets. "We paid full fare," Diana said clearly, and walked past her. Elijah followed without speaking. He found one, stowed his leather carry-on in the bin above the seat, heard the latch click firmly shut, and sat down. He buckled his belt, closed his eyes, and within 90 seconds, his breathing had slowed to the particular rhythm of a man who has learned to rest anywhere, because rest is something you take when it's available or not at all. Diana watched Patricia disappear toward the galley and felt the quiet certainty, the kind that comes from reading people for a living, that this was not over. 10 minutes after they boarded, while the rest of the business class cabin was still filling up, Patricia Voss came back down the aisle with the specific walk of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it. Shoulders set, chin slightly elevated, bypassing every other row as if they didn't exist, and stopping directly at row 1. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying to the rows immediately around them, "I need you to move that bag." Elijah opened his eyes slowly. "Excuse me," she pointed upward. "That bag in the bin above your seat is blocking the latch mechanism. It's a safety hazard. You need to gate check it." Elijah looked at the bin. It was closed. The latch was engaged. Without rushing, without sighing, without any of the performance of irritation that she was clearly hoping to provoke, he stood up, unlatched the bin, and opened it, turning so that Patricia and the passengers in the surrounding rows could all see clearly that the bag sat well within the space, nowhere near the latch, with room on either side. "It's not touching the mechanism," he said. "Look." Patricia's jaw tightened. A small red flush moved up from her collar. "I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft," she said, her voice rising just enough to ensure the rows behind them could hear. "And I am telling you, that bag is a safety issue. It needs to go in the hold." "It contains my surgical equipment," Elijah said quietly. Not defensively, not as a boast, just as a fact. The way you state a fact to someone who has asked for information. "I can't check it. And it fits. You can see that it fits." Diana leaned forward slightly. 3 bins behind us have bags that are visibly larger than my husband's," she said, in the specific tone she used when she was about to cite case numbers. "None of them have been flagged. Would you like to explain the selection process you used?" The flush on Patricia's neck deepened. She looked at Elijah with something in her eyes that went beyond professional disagreement. Something older and more personal than that something that lived in the part of her that had decided the moment she saw him walk down that jet bridge in a hoodie that he was a problem that needed to be managed. "Are you refusing a crew member's direct instruction?" she asked. The magic words, the trap. "I'm complying with the safety regulations that actually exist," Elijah said evenly, and sat back down. "If you'd like the captain to come and look at the bin, call him. He can see for himself." Patricia smiled a small, specific, triumphant smile that had nothing to do with aircraft safety and everything to do with what was about to happen next. She turned and walked toward the cockpit with the purposeful stride of a woman who had just been given exactly what she wanted. "She's going to play the victim," Diana said quietly, her voice low enough for only Elijah to hear. "She'll tell him you were aggressive. That's what this is. Let her tell him." Elijah said, though the knot forming in his stomach told him something that his reasonable mind was still refusing to accept. "The bin is closed. Logic will prevail." Diana looked at the cockpit door. "Logic doesn't live here," she said softly. "Authority does." In 2A, the man named James lowered his book and watched. The cockpit door opened 5 minutes later, and Captain Howard Crane came out the way a man comes out when he has already decided what he thinks before he has seen what he thinks about. He was everything his uniform suggested he should be: silver-haired, broad-chested, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed for press photographs, and eyes that moved around a room like they were counting what they owned. Patricia was behind him, positioned just slightly to his left and behind his shoulder, whispering rapidly. And whatever she was saying had already done its work, because when Crane reached row 1, he didn't look at the bin. He didn't look at the bag. He looked down at Elijah with the expression of a man who has already written the ending to a story he hasn't read yet. "Problem here," Crane said. His voice was the kind of deep that practiced authority produces. "No problem," Captain Elijah said, his hands resting flat and visible on his thighs. The bin is closed. The bag fits. You're welcome to look. Patricia tells me you were combative, Crane said. He still hadn't looked at the bin. That's not accurate, Diana said, sitting forward. My husband has been in his seat. He opened the bin to demonstrate that the bag meets the safety requirement. He has not raised his voice. I am an attorney, and I am a direct witness to everything that has happened in this row. Crane looked at Diana the way men who don't take women seriously look at women who are serious. A glance that lasted about half a second, and then dismissed her entirely. I didn't ask you, ma'am. I'm his wife, Diana said, and his legal counsel. And I'm telling you, your crew member is manufacturing a safety issue. Crane turned back to Elijah. He reached up and yanked the overhead bin open, not carefully, not in the measured way you open something to assess it, but with the sharp, decisive pull of a man making a point, and grabbed the leather carry-on and pulled it out fast and recklessly. And because it was heavy, and because the motion was careless, it swung down in a hard arc toward the headrest. Elijah stood up instinctively and caught it before it hit Diana. He lunged at me, Crane said immediately, stepping back and putting his hand on his radio. Patricia, get me the gate agent. Call Port Authority. Now. I was catching my bag, Elijah said, holding the carry-on. His voice still controlled, though the effort it was taking to keep it that way was visible now in the lines around his jaw. You stood up in a threatening manner while I was speaking. Crane said the words coming out with the smooth, practiced delivery of someone who has rehearsed a version of this before. He didn't touch you, wed the man in two. James speaking up carefully, like someone who knows he is crossing a line and is doing it anyway. The bag was falling. I saw it. Crane turned to him. Mind your business unless you want to be part of this. James closed his mouth. The book went back up in front of his face, but he wasn't reading it. The cabin had gone still in the specific, held breath way that means everyone understands that something wrong is happening, and nobody knows how to stop it. A few phones were raised. Most people looked straight ahead. Elijah sat back down. He told himself to stay calm. He told himself that reasonable people would look at a closed bin and draw a reasonable conclusion, and this would be over in 10 minutes. He had grown up in a neighborhood where knowing when to be still was a survival skill, and this was one of those moments. But what his reasonable mind still hadn't fully accepted was that there were no reasonable people in charge of this moment. There was only authority, and authority had already decided. Diana, he said quietly, get your phone out. Record everything. She was already reaching for it when Crane said, nobody touches any electronics. Hands where I can see them. Elijah looked at his wife. She looked at him. The geometry of what they were inside an enclosed space. A closed-door authority with a radio in its hand settled over them both without a word being spoken. 3 Port Authority officers boarded 6 minutes later, their boots heavy on the jet bridge floor, and the first thing they did when they reached the cabin door was look where Patricia was pointing, which was directly at Elijah, and the second thing they did was begin moving toward him. Sergeant Ray Doyle was the lead broad efficient, the kind of law enforcement officer who files good paperwork and doesn't ask questions he hasn't already answered in his head. He walked straight to row 1 without speaking to any of the passengers around it, without acknowledging James in 2A, without looking at the clearly visible overhead bin with the clearly functional latch, and he looked down at Elijah, the same way Crane had, with the same pre-formed conclusion in his eyes. Patricia gave her account in 30 seconds. He had refused. Crew instructions. Screamed at her. Lunged at the captain. Created a threatening situation that made her fear for the safety of the aircraft. Not one word of this was true, and at least 6 people in the surrounding rows knew it, but Doyle didn't ask them. Sir, stand up and turn around, Doyle said. You're under arrest for interference with a flight crew and assault on a captain. I did not assault anyone, Elijah said. His voice was not shaking, which took a specific kind of effort that only Elijah would know the cost of. "I am a physician. I have a patient in London who is in critical condition. This is a misunderstanding, and I need you to listen to me." "Tell it to the judge," Doyle said, and took his arm. Diana was out of her seat immediately, her voice sharp and clear, and carrying to every corner of the cabin. "I am his legal counsel. You are arresting Dr. Elijah Bowen. I need you to understand what the liability exposure is here. Step back, ma'am, or you're coming too." "I'm coming," Diana said, grabbing her bag with the precise movements of a woman who has never wasted emotion in her life. "I wouldn't stay on this aircraft if you asked me. But I promise you, every second of what is happening right now is going to cost someone a very great deal." Crane, watching from the cockpit doorway, told Doyle to get them off and get the luggage off too, and smoothed the front of his uniform with both hands, with the self-satisfied gesture of a man who has just handled something. They led Elijah down the aisle, the full length of it, past every row, past the mother who covered her child's eyes, past the man recording on his phone, past the woman who had been clutching her purse since this started, and past James in 2A, who looked at Elijah as he passed, with the expression of a man who knows he should have done more and doesn't know yet if he still can. At the door of the aircraft, Elijah stopped. He turned and looked back at Crane, who was still in the cockpit doorway, and he said quietly enough that the words didn't carry past the first few rows, "You just cost a little girl her life." Crane laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. "Keep walking, pal." Elijah looked at Patricia. She gave him a small, deliberate wave. The door closed behind them. The jet bridge swallowed them in fluorescent light, and behind that closed door, the crew of Atlantic Crown Flight 902 began preparing for departure. Certain as people who have never faced consequences can be that they had handled everything correctly. The gate area beyond the jet bridge was everything the first-class cabin wasn't bright fluorescent light that had no interest in being flattering thin airport carpet, that absorbed nothing, plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows that faced nothing in particular. After the ambient glow and soft leather of the aircraft, it felt like being pushed out of a theater into a parking garage, and Elijah stood in the middle of it in handcuffs, while a 20-something gate agent named Kevin Nash stared at his screen and tried to figure out how his Tuesday morning had arrived at this particular destination. Doyle stood slightly behind and to the right of Elijah, while the paperwork was processed, and the two other officers flanked the gate desk as if they were expecting someone to run. Diana had positioned herself at Kevin's left shoulder, close enough to read every word on his screen, which she was doing with the calm, thorough attention of someone who reads fast and remembers everything. Kevin's screen listed Elijah as a combative passenger refusal of crew instruction, physical threat to aircraft captain. Diana read these 3 lines, and then slowly and very precisely began naming everything that was false about each one of them, not with anger, but with the specific, methodical quality of someone who is building a record in real time. Kevin kept his eyes on the screen. Doyle told Elijah he could make his call from the station. Elijah turned to look at him, and what he said next, he said, carefully stripping away all the legal language and the institutional framing and the clinical distance, and making it as simple and as human as he could possibly make it, because he had been a doctor long enough to know that when you need someone to really hear you, the only thing that works is the truth, told plainly. "There is a 10-year-old girl in a hospital in London," he said. "Her name is Lily. She has a brain aneurysm in a location so deep that 6 other surgeons have already told her family they can't help her. I am the one who said I could. I told her grandfather I would be there this morning. Every minute I stand in this terminal is a minute that child is closer to a funeral instead of a birthday." Doyle was quiet. He looked at Elijah's shoes. Good shoes, Expensive shoes. The kind of shoes that you notice when you're trying to read someone. He looked at the passport in Elijah's hand, at the name printed there. He looked at Diana's posture, which was the posture of a woman who has argued in front of federal judges and won. And he looked at her face, which was not the face of someone who was lying. He had a daughter. She was 9. She had recently lost her first tooth, and he had taken a picture of the gap and set it as his phone wallpaper. He did not say any of this out loud, but it crossed his face in a way that Elijah, who had spent 30 years reading the faces of people under pressure, noticed. "One call," Doyle said. On speaker. 1 minute. Diana dialed a number she had saved in her phone under 2 initials and the word private. And it rang once, just once, before a man's voice answered, and the voice was gravelly and tired in the specific way that a person sounds when they have been awake for 3 days, running on fear and strong tea and the refusal to consider the worst outcome. Elijah Richard Caldwell said immediately. Not hello, not good morning. Just the name said with the relief of someone who was afraid he might not hear it. Richard Diana said, "It's Diana. We are not on that plane. We are at the gate at Miami International. Elijah is currently in handcuffs." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Kevin Nash stopped typing, and Doyle's hand moved almost involuntarily away from his belt. When Richard Caldwell spoke again, the fear was gone. What replaced it was something that a person who had never heard it before might mistake for calmness, but was actually something much colder, the sound of a man who has built and dismantled companies for 40 years and knows exactly how much damage he is capable of and has just decided to do all of it. "Tell me who did this," he said. Diana told him the purser's name, the captain's name, what they had done, and in what order, and the name of the officer standing in front of her husband with the handcuffs still on. Caldwell asked one question. "Is Elijah hurt?" Elijah leaned toward the phone. "I'm fine," he said. "My equipment might be damaged. Forget me, call another surgeon." "There is no other surgeon," Caldwell said, and the 4 words landed with the weight of something that had already been thoroughly examined and found to be simply, inarguably true. "If you don't get here, I bury my granddaughter on Friday." That is not me being dramatic. That is what my team at St. Thomas's told me this morning. He asked to speak to the officer holding Elijah. Doyle took the phone. He cleared his throat, which was something he did when he was stalling while he prepared himself. He said his name and his rank into the phone, and then for 90 seconds, he received what could only be described as a systematic and methodical accounting of every possible legal consequence of the decision he had made in the past 15 minutes, delivered in a voice that never rose above conversational volume, which somehow made it worse. Caldwell named Crane specifically a captain who had been the subject of 6 HR complaints in the past year for exactly this pattern of behavior. He named the charges he would personally pursue against the Port Authority, the airport, and Doyle individually. He told Doyle that he was speaking on a recorded line and that every word of this call would be preserved, and then he ended with a simple direct instruction. "Take the cuffs off, Sergeant." Kevin Nash looked up from his screen. His voice came out a little thinner than he intended. "Mr. Caldwell, he's the majority shareholder chairman of the board. I'm looking at it right now. It's him." Doyle reached into his pocket. He found the key. He unlocked the cuffs in a single practiced motion, and the sound they made coming off Elijah's wrists was quiet and final. "My apologies," Dr. Doyle said. The words came out stiffly, like they didn't fit his mouth very well, but they came out. Elijah rubbed his wrists. He looked through the gate window at the tarmac, where the tail of Flight 902 was still visible. The aircraft turned and taxiing slowly, the engines not yet at takeoff power. "Get me on that plane," he said. Inside the cockpit of Atlantic Crown Flight 902. Captain Howard Crane was in the best mood he'd been in all week. The engines were running. The aircraft was third in the queue for runway 9L, and the first-class cabin behind him was in his estimation exactly as it should be, orderly compliant and free of people who didn't belong there. He had his headset on and his coffee in the cup holder to his right, and he was running through the pre-takeoff checklist with his first officer, a 32-year-old named David Marsh, who was nodding at the right intervals and keeping his face carefully neutral, the way young co-pilots do when they are frightened of the man in the left seat. "Did you see the look on his face?" Crane said without looking up from the instrument panel. David kept his voice non-committal. He did have a priority. "One tag on the boarding pass, Captain. System glitch," Crane said, waving a hand. "Or a stolen upgrade." "Doesn't matter. The cabin is clean. Patricia did good work today." He keyed the interphone to the galley. "Patricia. Nice job this morning. Prepare for departure." Her voice came back warm and grateful through the speaker. "Thank you, Captain." "I really did feel unsafe." Crane nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has managed a difficult situation well and knows it. He went back to his instruments. The radio crackled. It was the tower supervisor, not the regular frequency, not the routine vector and clear-to-taxi voice that filled cockpits as background noise on a normal departure, but a tighter, more urgent voice, cutting through the channel with an unmistakable edge. "Handcuffed Crown 902, cancel takeoff clearance. Hold your position. Do not enter the runway. You are directed to return to gate D9 immediately. Expedite." Crane frowned. "Tower Crown 902, say again. We are third in line. We have a slot time." "Crown 902, this is not a request. Return to gate D9 immediately. This comes from company dispatch. Code red. Turn around now." The color left Crane's face so quickly that David noticed and looked over at him with the careful attention of someone watching a structure for the first signs of collapse. "Code red is for bombs and hijackings," Crane said. He reached for the radio. "Tower, what is the nature of the emergency?" "We didn't squawk any code." A new voice came back. Not the tower anymore. A direct company frequency patched through from the Atlanta Operations Center, ice cold and precise, in the way that director-level authority sounds when it has already been through every option and arrived at the last one. "Captain Crane. This is Director Halloway, Atlantic Crown Operations. You have removed the chairman's personal guests from this aircraft without authorization and filed a false safety report with Port Authority. You are directed to return to the gate, shut down your engines, and prepare to receive airport police. If your wheels leave the ground, you will be treated as operating without authorization." The cockpit was silent in a way it hadn't been before. Not the comfortable silence of a routine departure, but a different kind entirely, the kind that falls into a room when everyone in it understands that something irreversible has just happened. Crane's hand was still on the throttle quadrant. David was looking straight ahead at the runway lights in the distance, not blinking. The chairman Crane said. He said it the way someone repeats a word they've heard in a foreign language present in his mind, but not yet connected to anything he understood. David Crane said finally, his voice reduced to something much smaller than it had been 20 minutes ago. "Request taxi clearance back to the gate." "Yes, sir," David said, and reached for the radio with the quiet efficiency of a man who is very relieved that someone else is going to have to explain all of this. By the time Flight 902 began its slow, humiliating U-turn on the taxiway, a crowd had gathered at the windows of Gate D9, because airports are places where news travels faster than it should, and word of what was happening had spread in the particular way that information spreads through a terminal from gate agent to gate agent, picked up by a crew member on break, mentioned to a waiting passenger, forwarded in a text, whispered across a coffee kiosk, until a dozen people who had no professional stake in the situation were pressing their faces to the glass to watch a Boeing 737 do something. A Boeing 737 almost never does, which is turn around. Elijah stood at the window, with his hands at his sides, watching the aircraft crawl back toward the terminal. He was not triumphant. He was checking his watch every 90 seconds and doing the math in his head about London and prep time and the window that was still open if they left in the next hour. Diana was on the phone beside him, already talking to their hotel contact in London, already adjusting the timeline for the surgical team at St. Thomas's, her voice steady and businesslike, because there was no version of this where she allowed herself to feel what she actually felt until the work was done. Kevin Nash sat behind the gate desk, refreshing his computer screen with the expression of a man who has just realized that everything he said in the last half hour was probably recorded somewhere. Mr. Cole, the terminal station manager, 58 years old, impeccably dressed. The kind of administrator who runs everything smoothly and becomes visible only when something goes wrong, appeared at Elijah's side and introduced himself with the careful formality of a man whose apology is dressed in a suit. Dr. Bowen Cole said, "I cannot begin to explain how sorry I am. I want you to know that what happened here does not represent." "Open the door," Diana said without looking up from her phone. Cole looked at her. He nodded. He turned to Kevin. The jet bridge extended toward the returning aircraft, with the slow inevitability of something that had already been decided. The door opened, and Patricia Voss was standing at the threshold, with the expression of a woman who had been expecting a mechanic. What she got instead was Elijah Bowen walking through the door at a normal pace, without urgency and without drama, carrying his leather bag that Doyle had retrieved from the gate desk where Crane had left it, and he looked at Patricia, the way you look at a piece of furniture that is in the way, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the clear and quiet assessment of something that needs to be moved. And he walked past her into the cabin. The passengers who remained on the aircraft had been sitting in a state of confused suspension for the past 25 minutes, listening to the sound of the engines cycling down and the jet bridge reattaching, and now they watched in absolute silence as the man who had been marched out in handcuffs walked back down the aisle, as if the handcuffs had been a misunderstanding about the weather. Elijah reached row 1. He lifted his leather carry-on from where he was holding it. He opened the overhead bin, the same bin, and placed the bag inside. The latch engaged with a clean, solid click that was audible in the silence of the cabin. He sat down. He buckled his belt. He did not speak. He did not look around at the passengers watching him. He simply sat in the seat that had been his all along, and the completeness of the gesture, its quiet, and its restraint, and its absolute refusal to need anything more from anyone, was understood by everyone in that cabin, without a single word being said. Captain Howard Crane came out of the cockpit for the second time that morning, and the difference between this version of him and the one who had walked out 20 minutes ago was the difference between a man who has authority and a man who had it. He still stood the same way. The silver hair was still in place. The jaw was still the jaw that looked good on airline posters. But something behind his eyes had changed, some fundamental assumption about how this morning was going to end, and the absence of that certainty made him look smaller in his own uniform. He tried to speak. Something about how there had been a miscommunication, about how he had been working from the information provided to him, about how if he had known. Doyle stepped around Elijah without looking at Crane. He didn't need to look at him. He had the charges on a card in his breast pocket prepared during the walk, back across the terminal at the specific instruction of the voice on Diana's phone. Howard Crane Doyle said, "You are under arrest for filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, and criminal battery by proxy." The words landed in the cabin like a verdict, which was exactly what they were. Crane stared at the handcuffs with the expression of a man who has used authority as a weapon his entire career and has just discovered that it goes both directions. "You can't," he started, Mr. Cole Doyle said. Cole stepped forward with a tablet in his hand. He looked at Crane and then at Patricia, who had backed against the galley wall and was gripping the counter with both hands. His voice was professionally even, in the way that terminal managers learn to be when the situation requires absolute clarity. "Captain Crane, Ms. Voss, effective immediately, you are both suspended pending termination hearings. Please collect your personal belongings and leave the aircraft." "I was following protocol," Patricia said. Her voice had gone thin. He was aggressive. I felt unsafe. "We have footage from 11 passengers," Diana said from her seat in 1B, without looking up from her phone. She had not in fact reviewed 11 videos, but she had the absolute certainty of a woman who knows what happened and knows that the truth in this case was well documented by people who had been sitting close enough to see everything. Patricia looked around the cabin. The man in 2A James was already standing. "He never touched the captain," James said. His voice was steady now, not careful the way it had been before. The bag swung when the captain pulled it out. "That's what happened. I watched the whole thing. I'll sign a statement." He paused. "And I should have said so the first time. I'm sorry I didn't." Another passenger in the row behind stood. Then a voice from economy called out, clear and tired. "Just let us go to London." A brief, exhausted, relieved sound moved through the cabin, not quite a laugh, not quite applause, but something in between that meant the same thing. Patricia began to cry, audible, effortful sobs that had the quality of a performance, though whether she intended them that way was a question for a therapist and not for anyone on this aircraft. She was led up the aisle and off the plane by one of Doyle's officers, and Crane followed with handcuffs on and his hat in his hand, and neither of them looked back. From the back galley, a young woman named Chloe Reeves stepped forward. She was 28 years old and had been a junior flight attendant en routes with Crane for 3 years, and had spent most of that time doing exactly what David the co-pilot had done, keeping her face carefully neutral and her concerns very quietly to herself. She had watched what happened to Elijah from 40 feet away and had wanted to say something at every single point, during which she had said nothing. She walked to where Cole was standing and she said, "I'm qualified for lead purser. I'd like to take the position for this flight if you'll allow it." Cole looked at her. She was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. Her voice had been clear. "What's your name?" "Chloe Reeves, sir." "The position is yours," Chloe Cole said. "Get this plane ready. We leave in 15 minutes. 2 days later, in a conference room on the 4th floor of Atlantic Crown's Miami Crew Operations Center, Howard Crane arrived wearing a polo shirt and khakis, and the expression of a man who has been told by his union representative that this is all going to be fine. His union rep, a tired-looking man named Gary, who had been doing this job for 22 years and had seen worse, walked beside him with a lukewarm coffee and a reassuring narrative standard disciplinary hearing. Safety concerns, cited union backing, confirmed worst case a 2-week suspension with pay, and a note in the file. Crane listened and nodded and told Gary he wasn't worried that Richard Caldwell would cool down once he understood the full picture, that you couldn't just terminate a captain with 20 years of service and a clean safety record over a misunderstanding with a passenger. Gary pushed open the conference room door and Crane stopped walking. The table was full. At the head sat Arthur Neild, lead corporate attorney for Richard Caldwell. Personally, a man in his early 60s, in a dark suit that had clearly never been off the rack, with eyes that moved around a room the way a surgeon's hands move purposefully, without wasted motion, looking for exactly what they came to find. To his left, 3 additional litigators. To his right, the Miami-Dade police chief and 2 officers from the criminal division. In the corner, Mr. Cole. Against the far wall, Patricia Voss, already seated pale, in a way that her usual careful presentation could not conceal. Gary, the union rep, opened his mouth. "Sit down," Neild said. Just those two words without looking up from the documents in front of him, and something in the quality of the silence that followed them convinced Gary to do exactly that. Neil spent 30 minutes going through what Caldwell's team had assembled in 48 hours, the cockpit voice recorder gate surveillance footage that covered Patricia's original interaction with Elijah and Diana, from 2 angles body camera footage from Doyle's vest that had captured the full arrest, including Patricia's statement to Doyle, and signed statements from 11 passengers, including James, who had identified himself as a retired federal court judge and had written 3 pages. Every claim in Crane's police report was read aloud, and then set against the documented evidence. Not one of them held up. Crane's pension was stripped under the gross misconduct clause of his contract. His seniority and benefits were voided. His aviation certifications were flagged for review with the FAII, which in practice meant he would not fly a commercial aircraft again. The 2 officers from the criminal division stood up and explained the charges, filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, 2 counts of criminal battery by proxy, and Crane was handcuffed for the 2nd time in 3 days. This time in a conference room in front of people who had worked with him for years and were not covering their eyes. The specific human detail of it was this: Crane had a mortgage on a house in Coral Gables that he had been paying for 15 years. The lien that had been placed on the property that morning meant that the equity he had built, the thing he had intended to retire into the concrete evidence of everything his salary had amounted to, was no longer his to decide about. He looked at the table when they told him this, the same way Patricia had looked at the table in the cabin, and the expression on his face was the one that arrives when a person finally understands that the authority they have been borrowing from a position was never actually theirs to keep. 24 hours after the hearing, Richard Caldwell stood at a podium at Gate D9 in Miami International Airport and faced every major news network that covered aviation travel and civil rights, which in practice meant all of them. He looked older than his company photographs. He looked like a man who had been to London and back in 4 days and had not slept for most of it, and he made no effort to conceal any of that, because what he was about to say did not require him to look like a CEO. It required him to look like a grandfather. He named Elijah and Diana Bowen directly. He named what Elijah had done. The night of the incident had walked through a terminal in handcuffs, boarded an aircraft flown 6 hours across the Atlantic Ocean, and performed a surgery that most surgeons in the world would not have attempted, and he had done it all in a single night, following the worst kind of humiliation. And he had done it without once using his identity as a weapon against the people who humiliated him. He announced the Bowen Protocol immediate termination, no appeals lifetime industry ban for any Atlantic Crown crew member found to have profiled a passenger based on appearance. He announced 2 donations of $10 million each one to Howard University's Medical Scholarship Fund, 1 to Johns Hopkins, in the name of Elijah's father, who had cleaned office buildings at night so that his son could learn. He gestured behind him to the tarmac, where the Boeing 737 that had been the scene of everything sat in the morning sun with new livery on the nose, the standard company colors replaced from the cockpit, back with 4 words in gold letters, the spirit of dignity. This aircraft, Caldwell said, will fly every route we operate, not as a symbol, as a reminder. Every crew member who boards her will know what happened here and why it cannot happen again. A reporter in the front row asked if he thought this was enough. Caldwell looked at her for a moment. No, he said, but it is the beginning of enough, and beginnings matter. He stepped away from the podium. The press conference was over. The flight from Miami to London was 6 hours and 40 minutes of dark ocean, and the particular kind of silence that exists in a first-class cabin at 2 in the morning, when most passengers have accepted that sleep is the most efficient use of the time available. Elijah did not sleep on the way out. He had his laptop open on the tray table, and the MRI scans of Lily Caldwell's brain arranged across the screen in 3 different orientations, and he studied them with the focused attention of a man who does not believe in leaving anything to be figured out in the operating room that can be figured out beforehand. The aneurysm sat in the deepest navigable part of the brain, like a water bubble in a wall, fragile, specific, and positioned in exactly the place where the difference between saving someone and losing them came down to millimeters, and the quality of the hands doing the work. He thought about it the way you think about a conversation you are preparing to have with someone who cannot afford for you to say the wrong thing. Diana sat beside him. She was not reviewing the case. She would review the case later, after Lily was safe, when it could no longer hurt anything. Right now, she was watching her husband in the way she had watched him for 23 years, with the specific attention of someone who knows another person deeply enough to see what they are working through without being told. His shoulders were tight. She could see it in the way he held himself, the small resistance in his posture that came not from the surgery ahead. He was never tense about surgery, but from everything that had happened in the hours before it. Chloe came quietly to row 1 with 2 glasses of water and set them down without being asked and without fanfare. She looked at Elijah for a moment, and then she leaned in slightly and said something softly. Not about the airline or the hearing or what was coming for Crane, but something small and personal about what it had meant to her to watch him walk back through that door, and about the fact that she had wanted to say something during the confrontation and hadn't, and that she was sorry for that. Elijah looked at her. "You stepped forward when it mattered," he said. "That's what counts." She nodded once and went back to her work, and the steadiness she carried for the rest of that flight was a different kind of steadiness than the one she had boarded with. Diana, in the dark of the sleeping cabin, opened her laptop and wrote the first paragraph of the lawsuit against Atlantic Crown, Captain Howard Crane, Patricia Voss, the Miami Port Authority, and Sergeant Ray Doyle individually. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of legal writing that sounds like an explanation and functions like a blade, and she had it done in 20 minutes. And then she closed the laptop and looked out at the darkness over the ocean and allowed herself, for the first time since the gate area, to feel everything she hadn't let herself feel while they were inside the situation. The plane touched down at Heathrow in the gray early hours of a London morning, and instead of taxiing to a terminal, it taxied to a private hangar at the eastern edge of the airfield. And when the door opened, the cool English air came in, and Elijah stood at the top of the stairs and saw Richard Caldwell standing on the tarmac below. Not an assistant, not a representative. Richard himself in a dark coat and no tie, looking 20 years older than the man whose photograph appeared on the Atlantic Crown annual report. His face was gray with the specific exhaustion of a person who has not allowed themselves to sleep, because sleeping would mean accepting the possibility of the worst, and he had not been willing to accept that. Elijah came down the stairs. Caldwell didn't extend a hand. He took Elijah's arm just briefly, just the forearm, with the grip of a man who needed to confirm that the person in front of him was real and present and actually there. "She's in prep," Caldwell said. "They're scared to start without you. Her pressure has been climbing." "I know," Elijah said. "I looked at the numbers an hour ago." He picked up his bag. "Let's go." The ride through London was police-escorted and fast through wet streets in the gray early morning, and Elijah sat with his eyes closed the entire way. Not sleeping, but doing the thing he did before every significant surgery, which was to go through it in his mind in complete detail, from first incision to final closure, correcting himself at any point where he hesitated and beginning again until the path was clear and certain from beginning to end. When they reached St. Thomas's, the local surgical team looked like people who had been holding their breath since midnight. Their chief stepped forward to explain that Lily's vitals were declining, and perhaps they should consider, "Nobody touches her until I'm scrubbed," Elijah said, already moving. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. He was in the operating room 7 minutes later. The surgery lasted 6 hours and 12 minutes. Richard Caldwell and Diana sat in the viewing gallery above and watched through the glass, and from that distance, Elijah looked small under the surgical lights, compact and focused, moving with the specific, unhurried deliberateness that characterized all the best surgeons, the ones who have been doing this long enough to know that speed is not the same thing as efficiency. Richard had his forehead pressed against the glass at one point, and Diana put her hand briefly on his arm without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. When Elijah paused, not from uncertainty, but from listening, from taking the extra second to confirm what his hands already knew, Richard turned to Diana with the tight, quiet panic of a man trying not to show it. "Why has he stopped?" "He's hearing the artery," Diana said simply. "He does that. He's fine." The monitor changed, steadied. Elijah stepped back from the table and stripped off his outer gloves and looked up at the gallery and gave the single small nod that meant what it always meant. Richard Caldwell, chairman of the board of a company worth $4 billion, covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook once very briefly, and then he straightened and took a breath and looked back through the glass at his granddaughter, who was alive. The monitor kept beeping steady and continuous. That sound was the whole story. That evening in a hotel in Kensington, with London spread out in all its wet-lit nighttime geography below them, Elijah sat on the balcony with a glass of scotch he had been holding for 20 minutes, without drinking very much of it, and Diana sat beside him in a coat she'd pulled around her shoulders against the English chill, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when they've been through something they haven't finished processing yet. The surgery was done. Lily was stable. The monitors at St. Thomas's had settled into their steady, continuous, completely ordinary rhythm, and that rhythm meant everything. Elijah knew this. He was holding it. But underneath it and around it, and woven through it in ways he hadn't yet fully sorted out, was everything else that had happened between 4 in the morning in Baltimore and this balcony, and he was only now beginning to let himself look at it clearly. "I kept my hands still," he said, finally. "The whole time. Even when Crane grabbed the bag, I kept thinking if my hands move the wrong way in that cabin, nothing else matters. Not the surgery, not London, not Lily. If I reach for anything, and Doyle decides it's a threat, the whole story changes, and nobody asks questions until it's too late." Diana didn't say anything for a moment. She knew this. She had been thinking the same thing on the other side of the cabin, watching him keep his hands flat on his thighs, with the particular controlled stillness that she had learned over 23 years with this man meant that he was working very hard at something. 20 years, Elijah said. 20 years of getting it right, of never losing a patient I was supposed to save, of building something where the work speaks and I don't have to. He took a sip of the scotch, and in 5 minutes, a man who didn't know my name looked at my clothes and decided I was a problem that needed to be removed. "He didn't see you," Diana said. "Not as a comfort, as a fact." "No," Elijah agreed. "He didn't. And that's the part that doesn't go away when the handcuffs come off, because I shouldn't have to be Caldwell's surgeon to deserve a seat on an airplane. The man in 2A shouldn't have needed to know who I was to speak up. None of it should have required my credentials to become worth addressing." They sat with that for a moment. It was not a new thought. It was a thought that had been true for a long time, a pattern embedded in the small encounters and the large ones, and the whole accumulated weight of being a black man in America who had achieved everything that was supposed to make him invisible to this kind of treatment, and had found repeatedly that it didn't work that way. The exhaustion of having to be extraordinary in order to be treated as ordinary. The audience watching this story would understand that exhaustion without needing it, explained, because many of them had lived their own versions of it. "Crane is in a holding cell," Diana said. "His accounts are frozen. The house is under lien. The pension is gone. Arthur Neild told me this afternoon that the criminal case is tight enough that his public defender, and he'll need a public defender because the private attorneys won't touch it, is probably going to recommend a plea. Elijah nodded slowly. He looked out at the city. And Patricia, he said, terminated for cause. The FAA flag means she won't work in aviation again. She's hired a PR firm, apparently. They're planning to release a statement about how this was all a misunderstanding. Diana paused. I've already sent a letter to the firm with the relevant footage. Elijah almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close. His phone buzzed on the balcony railing. He picked it up and looked at the screen. A text from Richard Caldwell sent at 9:17 London time, 3 words. She's asking questions. He read it twice. He set the phone face down on the railing, picked up the scotch, looked out at the lights strung across the city below the Thames, just visible in the distance, dark and moving, carrying everything forward, the way rivers do regardless of what happens on the banks. Something in his shoulders came down. Not all the way, not completely, but by some measurable degree. The specific release of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has just confirmed that they can finally put it down. She's asking questions, he said. That means she's awake enough to ask questions. Yes, Diana said. They sat together in the English night and didn't need to say anything else. The next morning. St. Thomas's Hospital. 7th floor, a recovery room with high windows that caught the morning light and spread it in long, pale rectangles across the floor. Lily Caldwell was awake, not dramatically, not the way they show it in films where a person opens their eyes in a full close-up and immediately looks meaningful, but the real way, groggy and slow and a little confused about what city she was in, asking for water, in a voice that was rougher than usual, turning her head to find her grandfather in the chair beside the bed, where he had been sitting since before midnight. Richard looked at her, the way people look at things they were afraid they might not see again. Elijah came in 20 minutes later, still in the same clothes he had traveled in, having slept for 4 hours in the chair in the family waiting room down the hall. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Lily with the particular quiet satisfaction of a surgeon who has done the thing they came to do. Lily looked at him. "Are you the doctor who fixed my head?" she asked. "I am Elijah," said. "Did it hurt?" "Not for me," he said. She considered this with the specific seriousness of a 10-year-old working through a logical problem. Then, "Were you scared?" Elijah thought about the question. He could have given her the reassuring answer, the professional answer, the one that would have been kind and comfortable and completely dishonest. He looked at this child who had been through something she was too young to fully understand, yet who was going to grow up carrying the scar of it, and he decided she deserved the real answer. "A little," he said. "Not of the surgery, of something that happened before I got here. But I kept going anyway." Lily seemed to find this satisfactory. She settled back against the pillow. Richard, watching from his chair, looked at Elijah with the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood much earlier. "What it cost you," Caldwell said quietly. "Not a question. A recognition. To go through what you went through in that terminal and then get on a plane and then walk into that room and do what you did. I don't think I've ever asked what that kind of thing costs. Not once in 40 years of running airlines and making decisions about crew and passengers. I didn't think to ask. It costs something," Elijah said simply. "Tell me who made it possible," Caldwell said. "I mean it." "Every name," Elijah told him. Diana, who had never raised her voice. James in 2A, who had found his courage a little late, but had not let himself off the hook for it. Chloe, who had stepped forward after 3 years of being afraid. And Doyle, who had stopped and listened when he didn't have to. Richard listened to each name. He wrote them down in the small notebook he carried everywhere. He would remember every one of them, and what he did with those names in the weeks that followed would matter more than the press conference, or the lawsuit, or the gold letters on the nose of an aircraft. Lily fell asleep again. Her breathing was even and easy, and entirely ordinary, which was exactly the kind of miracle that looked like nothing at all from the outside. Elijah and Richard stood at the window together, looking out at the Thames, below two men who had come to this moment from completely different starting points and ended up, for reasons neither of them had planned, in exactly the same place at exactly the right time. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to perform what it meant. Outside, London moved forward, the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and continuous, and for the first time in 4 days, that felt like a good thing. 3 weeks later, on a clear Miami morning with the kind of light that makes even airport concrete look like something worth photographing, the spirit of dignity pushed back from Gate D9 for the first time under its new name. Chloe Reeves stood at the cabin door in her purser's wings, earned not given, not borrowed from someone else's fear, and greeted the first passenger aboard with the specific warmth of a person who has decided, after a long time, of not deciding exactly who she intends to be in her work. A small girl in economy pressed her face to the oval window as the aircraft lifted off, watching the runway fall away, below not knowing the name on the nose or the story behind it, just watching the ground get smaller the way children do with uncomplicated faith that the sky is safe and that someone responsible is in charge of getting them where they're going. In a courtroom in Miami on a Tuesday afternoon, Howard Crane sat in a polo shirt and khakis at a table with a public defender he had met 3 days ago. His pension was gone. His certifications were suspended. The house in Coral Gables was someone else's problem now. He looked at the table the same way he had looked at the overhead bin, as if the evidence in front of him still didn't quite add up to what it clearly was. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The authority in the room belonged to someone else entirely. In Baltimore on a Wednesday morning in an operating room on the 3rd floor of Johns Hopkins, Dr. Elijah Bowen was already scrubbed in when the patient was brought through the door. His hands were steady, the same hands that had been in handcuffs over the Atlantic, that had found their way to the deepest part of a child's brain in a London hospital at 4 in the morning, that had done what they had always done and would continue to do. The monitor beeped. The room was quiet. He began, "If this story moved, you please like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and the courage it takes to keep going."